The smell of burnt coffee and grease had become so familiar that Rebecca didn't even notice it anymore. She moved between tables with practiced efficiency, balancing plates on her arms, refilling cups before customers even asked, smiling through the exhaustion that had settled deep into her bones. It was nearly midnight at Rosie's Diner, and the late shift was finally winding down. A couple of truck drivers sat at the counter, and a group of college kids occupied a booth in the corner, their laughter cutting through the tired atmosphere. Rebecca's feet screamed with every step. 12 hours. She'd been on her feet for 12 straight hours, and this was her second shift of the day. "Rebecca, table 6 needs more ketchup," called out Danny, the cook. Through the kitchen window, she grabbed a bottle and headed over, painting on the same friendly smile she'd worn for the past decade. 10 years. Had it really been that long? Sometimes it felt like yesterday that she'd walked away from everything. Other times, it felt like a lifetime ago. After the last customers left and the chairs were stacked on tables, Rebecca found herself alone in the dining room. The old upright piano sat in the corner, dusty and forgotten. Most people didn't even know it was there. The owner had bought it years ago, thinking live music would bring in customers, but it never worked out. Now it was just another piece of furniture, something to squeeze past when carrying trays. Rebecca's fingers itched. They always did at the end of a long shift, when her mind was too tired to keep the memories locked away. She glanced toward the kitchen. Danny had his headphones in, cleaning the grill. The front door was locked. She sat down on the worn bench and lifted the fallboard. The keys were yellowed and chipped. She pressed middle C, and the sound that came out was sour, a half-step flat. The piano hadn't been tuned in years, maybe ever. But when she started to play, something magical happened. Her fingers remembered everything her mind had tried to forget. They moved across the keys like they were greeting old friends. And despite the piano's flaws, music filled the empty diner. Not perfectly, not the way it would have sounded in a concert hall, but real, raw, honest. She played a piece she'd learned when she was 19. Back when the world was full of possibility. Back when her biggest worry was whether she'd get the solo in the spring recital. Back when her mother was still healthy. "You're too good for this place, you know." Rebecca's hands froze. Danny stood in the doorway to the kitchen, arms crossed, a sad smile on his face. "I didn't know you were listening," she said, closing the fallboard quickly. Hard not to. You play like that, and people notice. He walked over and sat down at a nearby table. "How long has it been since you performed?" "Like, really performed?" 10 years. "Give or take." "That's a crime, Becca. That's like Picasso deciding to paint houses." She laughed, but there was no humor in it. Picasso didn't have medical bills that cost more than a house. Danny nodded slowly. He knew the story. Everyone who worked at Rosie's long enough learned bits and pieces of each other's past. It was that kind of place. Rebecca had been studying at one of those fancy music schools in the city. Full scholarship. Teachers said she was gifted. Then her mom got sick, cancer, the aggressive kind that required aggressive treatment. Someone had to work. Someone had to pay the bills. Someone had to be there for the appointments. In the bad days and the worst nights, her mother had lived for 3 more years. 3 years of treatment and hope and setbacks. 3 years of Rebecca working double shifts and sleeping in hospital chairs. 3 years of her piano sitting silent in their tiny apartment. When her mother finally passed, Rebecca was 25 and drowning in debt. The scholarship was long gone. Her spot at the conservatory had been filled by someone else. And somehow, she'd just ... stayed. Stuck in the pattern. Working, paying off bills. Surviving, but not really living. "You ever think about going back?" Danny asked. "To what?" "I'm 32. Danny, the music world doesn't want 32-year-old has-beens who never actually were. That's garbage and you know it." He stood up and walked to the community board near the entrance, unpinning a bright yellow flyer. "Look at this. Been hanging here for 2 weeks." He handed it to her. National Spotlight. The flyer read in bold letters. A nationwide talent competition. Open auditions. The winner would receive $100,000 and a professional recording contract. Reality TV talent shows? Rebecca shook her head. Those are for kids and people who can't make it the real way, or for people who deserve a second chance. Danny tapped the flyer. One audition. What's the worst that could happen? They say no? You're already living with no. Rebecca stared at the flyer long after Danny went back to finish closing the kitchen. The audition was in 3 weeks. 3 weeks to remember a full performance piece. 3 weeks to overcome 10 years of rust and doubt. 3 weeks to convince herself she was more than just someone who served coffee and scrambled eggs. That night, riding the bus home through the dark city streets, Rebecca couldn't stop thinking about it. Her reflection stared back at her from the window, and she barely recognized the woman looking back. When had she gotten so tired? When had her eyes lost that spark? Her studio apartment was small and shabby, but it was hers. In the closet, buried behind winter coats she rarely needed, was a black case. She pulled it out and opened it. Sheet music. Yellowed and worn, but still readable. Rachmaninoff, Chopin, Beethoven. The names alone sent a shiver through. She pulled out one particular piece. Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 2. The third movement. It was brutal. Technically demanding. The kind of piece that separated amateurs from professionals. She'd played it once, during her second year at conservatory, and her professor had called it the best student performance he'd heard in 20 years. Could she still do it? Her hands weren't young anymore. They'd spent the last decade gripping coffee pots and carrying heavy trays, not practicing scales and arpeggios, but sitting there on her worn carpet. Surrounded by memories of who she used to be, Rebecca made a decision. Maybe it was stupid. Maybe she'd embarrass herself. Maybe she'd get up on that stage and forget every note. Or maybe, just maybe, she'd remember what it felt like to be alive. The next morning, before her shift started, Rebecca walked into the diner early. The piano waited in its corner, patient and forgiving. She sat down and began to play, and for the first time in 10 years, she wasn't just passing time, she was practicing. Over the next 3 weeks, Rebecca lived in 2 worlds. During her shifts, she was the reliable waitress who never complained and always smiled. But before and after work, sometimes even during her breaks, she became someone else. Someone who had dreams bigger than the next paycheck. Her fingers, stiff at first, began to remember. Muscle memory was a strange thing. The notes that had lived in her hands for years hadn't disappeared. They'd just been sleeping, waiting for permission to wake up. The audition was on a Tuesday. Rebecca had requested the day off, something she never did. Danny had given her a thumbs up when she'd nervously asked. On the morning of the audition, standing in her small bathroom and looking at the only decent dress she owned, Rebecca felt the full weight of what she was about to do. This wasn't just an audition. This was a confrontation with every choice she'd made, every dream she'd buried, every version of herself she'd left behind. She picked up her folder of sheet music, took a deep breath, and walked out the door. The line outside the auditorium stretched around the block. Rebecca stood near the back, clutching her folder of sheet music against her chest like a shield. The morning sun felt too bright, too cheerful for how terrified she felt. Everyone around her looked so young, so polished. A girl who couldn't have been more than 19 stood in front of her, doing vocal warm-ups that sounded like professional opera training. Behind her, a group of guys with guitars compared notes about their YouTube followings and subscriber counts. Rebecca looked down at her dress. It was the nicest thing she owned, but she'd bought it at a thrift store 5 years ago for a funeral. The hymn was starting to fray. Next to these kids and their designer outfits and perfect makeup, she felt invisible. Worse than invisible, she felt foolish. First time, asked a woman standing beside her. She looked to be in her 40s, holding a violin case. Is it that obvious? Rebecca tried to smile. We all have that look. Like we're about to jump off a cliff and hoping we remember how to fly. The woman extended her hand. I'm Patricia, elementary school music teacher. Figured it was now or never, you know? Rebecca shook her hand, grateful for the kindness. Rebecca. I'm a waitress. Well, Rebecca the waitress, good luck in there. We're all just regular people trying for something extraordinary, right? The line moved slowly. Production assistants with clipboards and headsets moved up and down, checking people in, asking questions, occasionally pulling someone aside for a pre-interview. When one of them reached Rebecca, she felt her stomach drop. Name. The young woman had a bright smile and the kind of energy that suggested too much coffee. Rebecca Chen. Just Rebecca. Rebecca Torres. She fumbled over her words, cursing herself for being so nervous. Okay, Rebecca Torres. The assistant made a note. And what do you do for a living? Rebecca hesitated. This was the moment she could make herself sound more interesting. She could say she was a former music student. She could mention the conservatory. But something in her refused to hide. At a diner. The assistant's pen paused for just a fraction of a second, and Rebecca saw it. That flicker of surprise, maybe even pity. But the young woman recovered quickly and kept writing. Great. And what will you be performing today? Piano, Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 2, third movement. Solo arrangement. This time the assistant looked up, eyebrows raised. That's ambitious. Good luck. Another hour passed before Rebecca finally made it inside the building. The holding area was chaos. Singers doing scales. Dancers stretching. Magicians practicing card tricks. The energy was electric and terrifying all at once. Rebecca found a quiet corner and tried to review her music, but the notes swam before her eyes. What was she doing here? These people were performers. They lived for the spotlight. She'd spent the last decade hiding in diners and on night buses, trying to be as invisible as possible. How could she possibly compete? All piano players this way, please. The new assistant waved toward a hallway. Rebecca followed with about a dozen other contestants. They were led to a warm-up room where an upright piano sat against the wall. People took turns playing quick scales and running through difficult passages from their pieces. When Rebecca's turn came, her hands shook so badly she could barely hit the keys. The girl next to her noticed. First competition? First anything in 10 years, Rebecca admitted.
Oh, wow.
What made you come back? Rebecca thought about that question. About Danny and the yellow flyer. About playing that out-of-tune piano at midnight. About her mother who used to sit in the front row at every recital. Beaming with pride. I guess I got tired of being scared, she said finally. Before the girl could respond, another assistant appeared at the door. Rebecca Torres. You're up next! The walk to the auditorium felt like walking to her own execution. The assistant led her through a maze of hallways, making small talk that Rebecca couldn't focus on. Then suddenly, she was standing backstage, and through the gap in the curtains, she could see it. The stage was massive. Professional lights hung from the ceiling. In the center sat a beautiful grand piano, black and gleaming. And beyond that, the judge's table. 3 people sat there, looking bored and tired. They'd probably been watching auditions all day. Rebecca recognized 2 of them from the posters outside. On the left was Vincent Park, some kind of famous music producer. In the middle was Destiny Collins, a pop singer who'd won this same competition 5 years ago, now sat on the other side of the table. But it was the third judge who made Rebecca's breath catch. David Richardson. She'd studied his recordings at the conservatory. He was a legend in classical music. A pianist and composer who'd performed with every major orchestra in the world. He'd been a judge at international competitions. And now he was here, looking slightly uncomfortable in his formal suit, clearly wondering what he'd gotten himself into. Whenever you're ready, the stage manager whispered. Giving her a gentle push, Rebecca walked onto the stage. And the lights hit her like a physical force. She couldn't see the audience. It's just those 3 judges staring at her with expressions ranging from polite interest to obvious fatigue. Hey, good afternoon, Vincent said, glancing at his notes. Rebecca Torres. Tell us a little about yourself. Her mouth went dry. I'm 32. I work at Rosie's Diner on 5th Street. I've been a waitress for about 10 years. She saw Vincent and Destiny exchange a quick glance. But David Richardson's expression didn't change. He was watching her carefully, his fingers steepled under his chin. And what will you be performing for us today? Destiny asked, her voice sugary sweet in that way that successful people sometimes talk to service workers. Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 2, the third movement. Just the solo part. David's eyebrows went up. Just slightly, but Rebecca caught it. Vincent looked impressed, despite himself. Destiny looked confused, probably not recognizing the piece. That's quite a challenging selection, David said, speaking for the first time. His voice was deeper than Rebecca expected, with a slight accent she couldn't place. Have you performed this before? Once, a long time ago. When I was a student at Manhattan Conservatory. You went to Manhattan? Vincent leaned forward, suddenly more interested. For 2 years. Then I had to leave. Why? Destiny asked, and there was genuine curiosity in her voice now. Rebecca hadn't planned to tell them. But standing there under those lights, with nothing to lose, the truth came out. My mother got sick. Someone had to pay the bills. Someone had to be there. So I left school, and I started waitressing, and then, she paused, surprised by the emotion in her own voice. Then 10 years went by. The auditorium had gone very quiet. Even the crew members backstage had stopped moving. David Richardson was still watching her, but his expression had softened. I'm sorry about your mother, he said quietly.
Thank you.
Well, Vincent cleared his throat, shuffling his papers. Let's hear what you can do. Rebecca walked to the piano. The bench was adjusted perfectly. The keys gleamed under the lights. She sat down and positioned her hands, feeling the cool, smooth surface beneath her fingers. For a moment, everything disappeared. The judges, the cameras, the crew, the lights. It was just her and the piano, like all those nights at the diner. Except this piano was in tune. This piano was perfect. She took a breath and began to play. The first notes rang out clear and strong. And Rebecca felt something shift inside her. Her hands knew what to do. They'd been doing this since she was 6 years old, and no amount of coffee pots and dinner plates could erase that. The muscle memory was still there, sleeping, waiting. The piece started gentle, almost hesitant, like someone remembering how to hope. Then it built, becoming more confident, more passionate. Her fingers flew across the keys, executing runs that should have been impossible after 10 years away. But they weren't impossible. They were still there, waiting for her to claim them back. She poured everything into it. Every double shift. Every time she'd passed a concert hall and felt that ache in her chest. Every moment she'd spent wondering, what if? Every memory of her mother saying, play something beautiful for me, sweetheart. In the audience, Vincent had stopped writing notes. Destiny had put down her phone, and David Richardson had leaned forward in his chair, his eyes glistening in the stage lights. Rebecca's world had shrunk to just the music and the feeling of finally, after so long, being exactly who she was meant to be. The music poured out of Rebecca like water breaking through a dam. Her fingers moved across the keys with a speed and precision that shocked even her. This wasn't the careful, hesitant playing from her midnight practice sessions at the diner. This was something else entirely. Something raw and powerful that had been locked away for a decade. Just waiting for permission to be released. The technical passages that made this piece famous, the parts that professional pianists struggled with, flowed from her hands like she'd been playing them every day. But it wasn't just the technique. Anyone with enough practice could hit the right notes. What Rebecca was doing went deeper than that. She was telling a story. Every chord carried the weight of loss. Every crescendo held the pain of sacrifice. Every soft passage whispered of hope that refused to die. The music wasn't just coming from her fingers. It was coming from somewhere deeper. From the place where she'd buried all her dreams and disappointments and quiet moments of despair, backstage. A sound technician who'd been scrolling through his phone looked up. A production assistant who'd been walking past stopped in her tracks. The stage manager, who'd seen hundreds of auditions that day, set down his clipboard and just listened, in the wings. Patricia, the music teacher Rebecca had met in line, stood with tears streaming down her face. She'd been waiting for her own audition, but suddenly that didn't matter. All that mattered was this moment, this music. This woman who was playing like her life depended on it, because maybe it did. the piece built to its famous climax. The part where the orchestra would normally come crashing in. But Rebecca was alone up there, and somehow that made it more powerful. Her hands struck the keys with controlled fury, each note precise and deliberate, building and building until the entire auditorium seemed to vibrate with the sound. At the judges' table, Vincent had forgotten to breathe. Destiny's mouth hung slightly open, her usual professional composure completely shattered. And David Richardson, the man who'd heard the greatest pianists of his generation, who had performed on the world's most prestigious stages, who prided himself on maintaining professional distance, felt tears rolling down his cheeks. He wasn't even trying to hide them. He couldn't. In 40 years of judging performances, in decades of sitting through competitions and auditions and recitals, he had never heard anyone play Rachmaninoff like this. The technical mastery was extraordinary, yes, but technique was only half the equation. The other half was soul, and this woman had it in abundance. Rebecca reached the final section of the piece, where the fury gave way to something gentler. A kind of acceptance, maybe even peace. Her fingers moved more slowly now, drawing out each note, making every sound count. The music spoke of survival, of finding beauty even in the hardest moments, of refusing to give up even when giving up seemed like the only option. The last chord hung in the air, resonating in the perfect acoustics of the auditorium. Then silence. Complete, absolute silence. Rebecca lifted her hands from the keys slowly, as if waking from a dream. For a moment she forgot where she was. Then reality crashed back. The lights, the judges, the cameras. She'd actually done it. She'd performed Rachmaninoff's piano concerto. In front of people for the first time in 10 years, the applause started quietly. One person clapping, then another. Then suddenly the entire crew was applauding. The cameramen, the lighting technicians, the production assistants who'd been running around with clipboards. Everyone had stopped what they were doing to listen. Now they couldn't help themselves. Vincent was on his feet, clapping enthusiastically. Destiny stood too, her eyes wide with amazement. But it was David Richardson's reaction that made Rebecca's heart skip. He stood slowly, tears still visible on his face, and the applause grew louder. The legendary composer and pianist, known throughout the classical music world for his stern critiques and impossibly high standards, was giving her a standing ovation. "Stop," David said, his voice rough with emotion. The applause died down. "Stop the cameras for a moment." The cameraman looked confused, but one of the producers nodded, and red recording lights blinked off. David shook his head. "Actually, no. Keep them rolling. Turn them back on. People need to see this. People need to understand what just happened here." Cameras came back to life. David walked around the judges' table, something Rebecca realized he probably never did during auditions. He approached the stage, and she stood up from the piano bench, her legs shaky. "Young lady," he said, and his voice cracked. He paused, composing himself, but the tears kept coming. "I need you to understand something. I've been a professional musician for 40 years. I've judged at the Chopin competition in Warsaw. I've sat on panels at the Tchaikovsky competition in Moscow. I've heard the best pianists in the world play this exact piece. What you just did," David continued, "was one of the most profound performances I've ever witnessed. Not just heard, witnessed, because that wasn't just music. That was truth." Destiny was nodding, wiping at her own eyes. Vincent looked stunned, like he'd just witnessed something he couldn't quite process. David turned to face the cameras directly. Rachmaninoff wrote this concerto when he was in the depths of despair. His first symphony had been savaged by critics. He fell into a depression so severe that he couldn't compose for 3 years. He thought his career was over. He thought he'd lost everything. He turned back to Rebecca. And then he wrote this. This piece that transformed his suffering into something transcendent. Something that could speak to people across time and culture and circumstance. That's what great art does. It takes pain and makes it beautiful. It takes loss and makes it meaningful. Rebecca felt her own tears starting. She hadn't expected this. She'd expected a yes or a no, maybe a compliment if she was lucky. She hadn't expected this. When you walked out here, David said gently, I saw a waitress. Someone who'd be lucky to get through a difficult piece without major mistakes, and I'm ashamed of that assumption. Because what you just showed me, showed all of us, is that you're not just a waitress. You're an artist. A real artist. Not someone who's simply been trained in technique, though your technique is flawless, but someone who has lived. Someone who has suffered and survived and found a way to transform that experience into something that can move people to tears. He gestured to his face, to the tears he wasn't bothering to hide. I don't cry at auditions. I've built a reputation on being the tough judge, the one who doesn't let emotion cloud his judgment. But what you just did wasn't just good. It wasn't just excellent. It was necessary. It was true. Vincent spoke up, his voice unsteady. Can I ask you something, Rebecca? Those 10 years you spent waitressing, do you think of them as wasted time? Rebecca thought about the question. About the double shifts and the aching feet. About the medical bills and the goodbye. About every moment she'd wondered if she'd made the wrong choice. I used to, she said quietly. Every single day, I used to think about everything I'd lost. The career I could have had. The stages I could have played on. I used to think those 10 years killed my dreams. And now? David asked gently now. Rebecca looked down at her hands, at the fingers that had served coffee and carried plates and somehow impossibly still remembered how to play. Now I think maybe those years taught me something I couldn't have learned in any conservatory. They taught me what the music actually means. What Rachmaninoff was feeling when he wrote it. Because I've been there too. In that place where you think everything is over and there's no way back. The auditorium was so quiet you could hear people breathing. Rebecca looked up at the 3 judges, at the cameras, at the crew members who'd all gathered to watch. Music isn't just about playing the right notes, she said. It's about understanding what those notes are trying to say. And you can't understand loss and hope and survival from a textbook. You have to live it. David nodded slowly, a small smile breaking through his tears. You've lived it, and it shows. That's what made this performance extraordinary. You didn't just play Rachmaninoff. You understood him? You were him. He turned to the other judges. I don't even need to ask for their votes. I already know. Vincent was nodding emphatically. That's a yes from me. The biggest yes I've ever given.
Ow.
Destiny was still wiping her eyes. Yes, absolutely yes. I don't even know what else to say except that was incredible. David looked at Rebecca, and in his eyes she saw something she hadn't seen in years. Recognition, not pity, not surprise, but genuine respect. From me, he said, it's not just a yes, it's a promise. Whatever happens in this competition, whatever comes next, I want to help you finish what you started 10 years ago. You deserve that chance. Rebecca couldn't speak. She could only nod, the tears flowing freely now as the applause erupted again, louder than before. Rebecca walked off that stage in a daze. Her legs felt like they might give out at any moment. Production assistants were suddenly everywhere, asking her to sign releases, scheduling her for the next round, congratulating her with genuine smiles instead of the polite indifference she'd received earlier. That was unbelievable, one of them said. A young guy with a headset who looked barely old enough to drink. I've been working on this show for 3 seasons, and I've never seen the judges react like that. Never. Patricia found her in the hallway and pulled her into a tight hug. You did it. Oh my God. You actually did it. I don't even know what just happened, Rebecca admitted, her voice shaky. What happened is you reminded everyone in that room why music matters. Patricia pulled back, holding Rebecca by the shoulders, including yourself. Psst. The ride home on the bus felt surreal. Rebecca kept replaying the moment in her head. David Richardson's tears, the standing ovation, his promise to help her. It felt like something from a dream, like she might wake up any moment back in her apartment with her alarm blaring. Late for her shift at the diner, but when she walked into Rosie's the next morning, Danny took one look at her face and broke into a huge grin. You did good, didn't you? I think so. I don't know. It felt good. And the judges, they all said yes. Danny whooped so loud that the early morning customers looked up from their coffee. He came around the counter and lifted her in a bear hug, spinning her around. I knew it. I knew you had it in you. Rebecca laughed, feeling lighter than she had in years. But as Danny set her down, and she tied on her apron, reality settled back in. She'd made it through one audition. The competition had multiple rounds. And even if she made it all the way through, what then? She still had rent to pay, bills to cover, a life that didn't stop just because she'd had one good moment. You're thinking too much, Danny said, reading her expression. Just enjoy this. You earned it. 3 days later, Rebecca's phone rang while she was in the middle of the lunch rush. She almost didn't answer, but the number looked official. Hello? Ms. Torres? This is Helen from National Spotlight Production. I'm calling because David Richardson has specifically requested to speak with you. Would you be available for a meeting tomorrow afternoon? Rebecca nearly dropped a plate. David Richardson wants to meet with me. Yes, he's only in town for another 2 days before he flies back to Vienna. He'd like to meet at Carnegie Hall if that works for you. Carnegie Hall. David Richardson. Tomorrow? Rebecca's mind spun. Yes, she managed to say. Yes, that works. She spent the rest of her shift in a fog. Carnegie Hall wasn't just any venue. It was one of the most famous concert halls in the world. And David Richardson wanted to meet her there. That night, she could barely sleep. She kept wondering what he wanted to talk about. Had he changed his mind? Was he going to tell her she wasn't good enough after all? Or maybe it was good news. Maybe he really meant what he said about helping her. The next afternoon, Rebecca stood outside Carnegie Hall in her best outfit, which still wasn't very impressive. The building was beautiful, all red brick and arched windows. People in expensive clothes walked past, heading to some afternoon performance. She felt completely out of place. Inside, a woman at the information desk directed her to a rehearsal room on the 3rd floor. Rebecca climbed the stairs slowly, her heart pounding. When she reached the door, she could hear piano music coming from inside. She recognized it immediately. Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major. One of the most beautiful pieces ever written. She knocked softly, and the music stopped. Come in, David's voice called out. He sat at a grand piano in a small but elegant rehearsal room. Windows looked out over the city. The walls were covered in photographs of famous musicians who had performed there over the decades. David stood when she entered, smiling warmly. Rebecca, thank you for coming. Thank you for inviting me. I still can't believe I'm here. Sit, please. He gestured to a chair near the piano. I wanted to talk to you away from the cameras and the production staff. What I said during your audition, I meant every word. But I also know that pretty words don't pay bills or change circumstances. Rebecca nodded, not sure where this was going. I made some calls after your audition, David continued. I spoke with the director of the Manhattan Conservatory. I also reached out to the Steinway Foundation and the Classical Music Education Fund. Between the 3 of us, we've arranged something. He handed her a folder. Rebecca opened it with trembling hands. Inside were official letters, forms, scholarship information. If you want to complete your degree, David said gently, you can. Full scholarship for however long it takes. No strings attached. Whether you win this competition or not, whether you decide to pursue music professionally or not, the opportunity is there. Rebecca stared at the papers, unable to speak. This was what she'd dreamed about for 10 years. The chance to finish what she'd started. To be a real musician again. I don't understand, she finally managed. Why would you do this for me? David sat down on the piano bench, his expression thoughtful. When I was 25, I was in a car accident. Broke both my hands. The doctor said I might never play again. For 2 years, I couldn't perform. I thought my career was over before it had really begun. He looked down at his hands, flexing his fingers. But I had people who believed in me. Teachers who didn't give up. A mentor who paid for my therapy and rehabilitation out of his own pocket. Because he said talent like mine was too precious to waste. Those people saved my life. They saved my music. What you have is rare. Not just technical skill, though you have that in abundance, but the ability to make people feel something. to connect with music on a level that goes beyond notes on a page. That's not something that can be taught. You either have it or you don't, and you have it. Rebecca felt tears welling up again. She seemed to cry a lot lately. I'm not doing this out of charity, David continued. I'm doing it because the world needs your music. Because Rachmaninoff and Chopin and all the great composers wrote their music for people like you. People who understand what they were trying to say. And because someone once gave me a second chance, and now I have the opportunity to do the same for you. I don't know what to say. Say you'll think about it. I know it's not simple. You have a job, responsibilities, a life you've built. I'm not asking you to throw that all away tomorrow. But I am asking you to consider the possibility that maybe, just maybe, those 10 years weren't wasted. Maybe they were preparation. And maybe now is the time to step into what you were always meant to do? They talked for over an hour. David told her about the program, about the flexibility they could offer for someone in her situation. He introduced her to the idea of performance scholarships, teaching opportunities, ways she could earn money while studying. He made it seem possible instead of impossible. Before she left, David had one more surprise. He led her down the hall to the main concert hall, the famous Isaac Stern Auditorium. Even empty, it took Rebecca's breath away. Row after row of red seats rising up to the ceiling, the stage, massive and beautiful. Next spring, David said, I'm organizing a benefit concert for the Classical Music Education Fund. Young artists who are getting second chances, returning to music after time away. I'd like you to perform. Full orchestra. Rachmaninoff's complete second concerto, all 3 movements. Here on this stage. Rebecca looked at him, wondering if she'd heard right. But that's months away. I haven't even finished the competition. What if I don't make it through? This has nothing to do with the competition. This is about you and your music. So what do you say? Will you play here? Rebecca looked out at the empty hall, imagining it filled with people. Imagining herself on that stage, not in a diner at midnight, not in a audition hoping for a yes, but as a real performer in one of the most prestigious venues in the world. Yes, she whispered. Yes, I'll play. Walking out of Carnegie Hall that evening, Rebecca felt different. Lighter somehow, like she'd been carrying a weight for 10 years and someone had finally helped her set it down. She pulled out her phone and called Danny. Hey boss, she said when he answered. I need to talk to you about my schedule. Things are about to get complicated. Danny laughed. Complicated is good. Complicated means life is happening. Tell me everything. That night at the diner, during a quiet moment between dinner rush and the late-night crowd, Rebecca sat at the old upright piano. She played softly, not wanting to disturb the customers. But even on that out-of-tune instrument, music sounded different now, hopeful, full of possibility. A regular customer. An elderly man who came in every Tuesday for the meatloaf special. Stopped by the piano on his way out? You play beautifully, he said. Have you ever thought about doing it professionally? Rebecca smiled. Actually, I have. And you know what? I think I finally will. The man nodded approvingly and left a generous tip on the counter. After he was gone, Rebecca looked around the diner. At Danny cooking in the kitchen, at the worn booths and the cracked vinyl seats, at the coffee-stained menus and the community board where that yellow flyer had hung. Just weeks ago, this place had been her refuge when she needed one. These people had been her family, and she'd always be grateful for that. But maybe it was time to remember that refuges were supposed to be temporary. Safe places to rest and heal before stepping back out into the world. She was ready to step out. Finally, after 10 long years, she was ready. The competition footage aired 3 weeks later on a Tuesday night. Rebecca watched it at the diner after her shift, surrounded by Danny, the other waitstaff, and a handful of regular customers who'd heard about it and insisted on being there when she walked onto that stage on screen. Looking nervous and small, one of the regulars said, "That's our Becca," and everyone cheered. Then the music started, and the room went completely silent. Watching herself play was strange. Rebecca had been so lost in the moment during the actual performance that she didn't remember half of it. But seeing it now, seeing the intensity on her face, hearing the power in the music, she understood why people had reacted the way they did. That woman on screen wasn't just playing piano. She was telling her story without saying a single word. When David Richardson started crying on screen, Danny let out a low whistle. Man, you really got to him. By the time the episode ended with all three judges giving their yeses, half the people in the diner were crying too. Rebecca's phone started buzzing immediately. Texts from old friends she hadn't heard from in years. Messages from former classmates at the conservatory. Even her landlord sent a text saying he'd watched and was proud of her. But the real surprise came the next morning. The video had gone viral overnight. Millions of views. Comments from all over the world. People sharing their own stories of abandoned dreams and second chances. Parents tagging their kids saying never give up. Musicians writing long posts about the importance of life experience in art. Rebecca's social media, which had been practically dormant for years, exploded. Interview requests came in from local news stations, music blogs, even a few national morning shows. It was overwhelming and terrifying and exhilarating all at once. The competition continued over the next few months. Rebecca made it through the second round, then the third. Each time she performed, she got better, more confident. The camera loved her story. The judges loved her music. And the audience fell in love with both. But there were challenges too. Balancing work at the diner with rehearsals and competition appearances wasn't easy. She was exhausted most days, running on coffee and adrenaline. Danny had adjusted her schedule as much as he could, but bills still needed paying. Then something unexpected happened. Regular customers at the diner started leaving bigger tips. Much bigger. One woman left $100 on a $12 check with a note that said, "For your music education. You've given us so much joy over the years." Others followed. The tip jar that usually held a few crumpled ones started filling with 20s and 50s. One evening, a well-dressed businessman came in, ordered coffee, and left an envelope with $500 inside. "I saw your audition," he said simply. "My daughter plays piano. You inspired her. This is the least I can do," Rebecca cried in the kitchen while Danny patted her back. "See," he said. "People are good. They want to help. Let them." The competition semifinals came on a cold November evening. Rebecca performed Chopin's Ballade No. 1, a piece she'd learned years ago but had refined over months of practice. She made it through but didn't advance to the finals. A young violinist from Seattle and a singer from Houston beat her out. She wasn't devastated like she thought she'd be. Standing backstage after the results were announced, Rebecca realized something important. This competition had never been about winning. It had been about remembering who she was. About proving to herself that the last 10 years hadn't erased her talent or her passion. David found her in the green room afterward. "How are you feeling?" "Okay, actually. Better than okay?" Rebecca smiled. "I gave it everything I had. That's all anyone can do. You know what I admire most about you?" David said, "It's not your technique, though. That's exceptional. It's your perspective. You understand that music isn't a competition. It's a calling, and you've answered it." He reminded her about the Carnegie Hall concert in the spring. "That's your real victory, not this show. That stage, that orchestra, that audience, that's where you belong." The months that followed were a whirlwind. Rebecca enrolled in the scholarship program and started taking classes again. It felt strange at first, being back in a conservatory, surrounded by students 10 years younger. But her teachers quickly realized she brought something to the classroom that the younger students lacked. Life experience, understanding, depth. She still worked at the diner, but part-time now. Danny had been understanding, even encouraging. "You're meant for bigger things in this place," he told her. "But you're always welcome here. Always." The spring concert at Carnegie Hall approached faster than Rebecca expected. The rehearsals with the full orchestra were intense. Rachmaninoff's second concerto with orchestra was a different beast than the solo. That arrangement she'd performed at the audition. More complex, more demanding, more everything. There were moments when doubt crept in. Late nights, when she'd stumble through a difficult passage and wonder if she was good enough. If she deserved this chance, if maybe she should just stay in her comfortable, small life where the stakes weren't so high. But then she'd remember her mother. Not the sick version, the one from the hospital, but the healthy one, the one who used to sit in the front row at every recital, beaming with pride. The one who'd say, "Play from your heart, sweetheart. That's where the real music lives." The night of the Carnegie Hall concert arrived. Rebecca stood backstage in a borrowed performance gown, her hands shaking slightly. Through the curtain, she could hear the audience filling the hall. Nearly 3,000 people. More people than she'd played for in her entire life combined. Danny was out there somewhere, wearing a suit for probably the first time in years. Patricia, the music teacher from the audition line, had driven up from Philadelphia. Old friends from the conservatory, regular customers from the diner, and somewhere in that crowd, sitting in one of the best seats in the house, was David Richardson. The conductor, a woman named Melissa Chen, who'd won a Grammy last year, gave Rebecca an encouraging smile. "Ready?" "As ready as I'll ever be. Remember, they're not here to judge you. They're here to experience music. Just share what you have to share." Rebecca walked onto that stage, and the applause was thunderous. She sat at the piano, the same instrument that legendary performers had played for over a century. The orchestra behind her, instruments poised and ready. The conductor raised her baton. This was it. This was everything. The music began softly, strings introducing the famous melody. Then Rebecca's hands touched the keys, and she was home. Not nervous anymore. Not doubting. Just playing, just feeling, just being exactly who she was meant to be. The first movement flowed like a conversation between her piano and the orchestra. The second movement was tender and heartbreaking, and she thought of her mother, of loss, of love that transcends death. The third movement built to that same powerful climax she'd played at the audition. But now, with the full orchestra behind her, it was like riding a wave of pure sound. When the final chord rang out, there was a moment of perfect silence. Then the audience exploded. Standing ovation, flowers thrown onto the stage, people cheering and crying and celebrating not just the music, but what the music represented. Hope, second chances, the courage to try again. Rebecca stood and bowed, tears streaming down her face. The conductor hugged her. The orchestra members tapped their bows against their music stands in approval. The musician's way of showing respect. Backstage afterward, she was surrounded by people. Congratulations came from every direction. But the moment that meant the most was when Danny pushed through the crowd and pulled her into a fierce hug. "Your mom would be so proud," he whispered. "I hope you know that." "I know," Rebecca said. "I finally know." 3 months later, Rebecca graduated from the conservatory with honors. She'd completed in one intensive year what normally took two, fueled by determination and a decade of pent-up passion. Job offers came in. Performance opportunities. Teaching positions at prestigious schools. She took a job as a performer with a chamber, music ensemble, and a part-time teaching position at a community music school in a low-income neighborhood. She wanted to work with students who couldn't afford private lessons, kids who had talent but no resources. Kids like she might have been if circumstances had been different. She still stopped by Rosie's diner once a week. It's always on Tuesday nights. She'd have coffee with Danny, catch up with the staff, and sometimes, if the place wasn't too busy, she'd play that old upright piano in the corner. It was still out of tune. Danny had offered to get it fixed, but Rebecca always said no. "It's perfect the way it is," she'd say. "It reminds me where I came from." And that's important. One Tuesday evening, a young woman came into the diner during Rebecca's visit. She looked exhausted, wearing a fast food uniform from her shift. She noticed Rebecca at the piano and stopped to listen. When Rebecca finished playing, the woman approached hesitantly. "That was beautiful. Do you perform professionally?" "I do now," Rebecca said with a smile. "But I used to work here. I was a waitress for 10 years. The woman's eyes widened. "Really? But you play so well? How did you go from waitressing to performing?" Rebecca thought about that question. About yellow flyers on community boards. About courage that comes from desperation. about legends who cry at auditions, about second chances and the long road between giving up and trying again. I stopped believing that my past defined my future, Rebecca said simply, and I let people help me when I needed it most. Those two things changed everything. The young woman nodded slowly, something shifting in her expression. Hope. Maybe. Possibility. Rebecca pulled out a card for the community music school where she taught. If you ever want to learn, she said, we have scholarships. We have programs for people who work full-time. We have teachers who understand that it's never too late. The woman took the card, holding it like it was precious. Thank you, she whispered. After she left, Danny came over and sat down next to the piano. You're changing lives now. How does that feel? Rebecca looked around the diner, at the place that had held her together when she was falling apart. At the piano that had kept her sane during the darkest years. At the friend who'd never stopped believing she was meant for more. It feels like coming full circle, she said. Like everything, even the hard parts, happened exactly the way it was supposed to. And for the first time in longer than she could remember, Rebecca believed that completely.